So we're picking up in chapter 27 with the Allied strategy in World War II. And that strategy was simply Europe first. The Japanese threat it was a real threat, but it was contained. Hitler, however, threatened to knock the Soviet Union out of the war altogether. So there were two ways about which this could happen. The United States and the USSR wanted to get into France as soon as possible to set up a front there. The Germans had taken France early on. Churchill, on the other hand, Prime Minister of Great Britain, instead pressed for a strategic bombing or a set of strategic bombing raids on German cities and an invasion of North Africa, which was also held by the Germans. And Churchill got his way. So in 1942, Allied planes began to bomb German cities, and an Allied force under Dwight Eisenhower, who would later become the United States president, took on North Africa and invaded German-held North Africa. The good thing about the French having conditional terms of surrender to the Germans was that it allowed Eisenhower to press forward quickly against the Germans after encountering only light resistance from the Vichy French forces. Basically, the Vichy French forces were like a German puppet government in central France. So the fact that they had conditional terms of surrender allowed him to move quickly into France after he got into North Africa. German General Rommel and his Africa Corps surrendered in May of 1943 in North Africa. And in July, just a couple of months later of the same year, 1943, the Allies then invaded Sicily so that they could advance to the Italian mainland in September and take Italy. But by the fall of 1943, the Soviets had begun to check the Nazi advance at Stalingrad, and the Allies were beginning to push their way up the Italian peninsula. So the Germans overwhelmed. Two things happened with Germany that began to shift the tide of war. The first was D-Day, which was June 6th, 1944. That is a very important date. So I'll write it here. June 6th, 1944. Again, this is D-Day, Demolition Day. But this was a massive attack, and it was organized by the Allied forces on the beaches of Normandy, on the coast of Normandy in France. And, lines of people were hopping off of planes, coming onto the shores of the beaches of Normandy, and the Germans were just mowing them down with machine guns. But that, even though it was a devastating loss for the Allies as well, began to check German power in France. In the east, millions of Soviet troops slowly pushed back Axis lines. So there's progress on the Western Front, progress on the Eastern Front. Eisenhower himself prepared for a general advance, and while he was doing so, the Germans launched a counterattack that was actually planned by Hitler himself. They had hoped to break through the Belgian port of Antwerp so that they could divide the Allied powers into two parts. That wasn't really what happened. The Allies successfully turned back the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge, and this battle took place through a densely forested region of Belgium, France, and Luxembourg called the Ardennes. Probably pronounced that wrong, but Ardennes. I don't know what it is. This is two N's right here. But this forest, again, is in Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. This was an Allied victory, and the good thing was that it cost the Germans their very last reserves. And that's not to say that it wasn't costly for the Americans as well. There were 77,000 men who died here, and they actually delayed Eisenhower's offensive. But it was still an Allied success. So on May 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allied powers. And as the Allies advanced into Germany, the horror of the Nazi death camps unfolded. The United States had actually received news of the camp earlier than this, but Roosevelt declined to take any action to save the refugees or to even bomb the camps or the rail lines leading to the camps. So the naval war in the Pacific. So we're backtracking time-wise, but we're going to a different place on the globe here. So again, the first priority was to defeat Germany, but American forces in the Pacific wanted to prevent further Japanese expansion. After all, the Japanese, this is why we entered the war to start with. But in spite of heavy losses, the American Navy was able to turn back a Japanese convoy at the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942. And then at the Battle of Midway, the U.S. fleet decisively defeated a Japanese armada. And in this battle, 300 Japanese planes were destroyed. So after that, the initiative in the Pacific pretty much shifted to the Americans. And there were two separate drives. You have MacArthur leading one from New Guinea toward the Philippines, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, who led one through the Central Pacific, marching toward Tokyo. So in a series of battles around Guadalcanal, American forces were able to eject the Japanese from the Solomon Islands. And in this series of raids or whatever, the American air power really proved to be decisive in protecting Australia from a flank attack. American forces continued to advance steadily, and the ones headed toward Tokyo, and by mid-1944, American land-based bombers were within range of Tokyo. And then in February 1945, MacArthur had successfully liberated the Philippines from Japan. So the United States was, by and large, very successful in their two drives in the Pacific. Two battles in Philippines water took place in 1944 that pretty much completed the destruction of Japan's sea power and reduced its air power to kamikazes, pretty much. American forces took Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which, only a few hundred miles from the Japanese mainland, in March 1945. The problem, though, was the tenacity of Japanese soldiers. It made it seem like the actual invasion and conquest of Japan would take at least another year and cost an additional 1 million American casualties. They had to be blasted and burned from tunnels and concrete pillboxes with hand grenades and flamethrowers and dynamites because they just would not give up. And because they would not give up, even though it was clear that they were losing, it cost millions more casualties. Speaking of casualties, following Roosevelt's death in April of 1945, Harry Truman took office and became America's president. And the scientific community presented him with a powerful new weapon, the atomic bomb. The United States had devoted over 6 years and $2 billion to develop this weapon under the leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who quoted the Bhagavad Gita, I think as he watched it being tested, but the quote was, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The days that those things were dropped, hundreds of thousands of people died that day, and then 100,000 people died later, not to mention those who suffered cancer or genetic deformation or radiation poisoning as a result of those bombs being dropped in Japan. The debate over the use and the purpose of nuclear weapons have pretty much raged on since then. After the first successful test of this atom bomb on July 16th, 1945, Truman faced a really difficult decision. He could authorize bombing the Japanese cities with this weapon, or he could finish the war using conventional means. And the motives behind Truman's decision to use the bomb are still debated. I'm sure he was torn between his knowledge that this was the worst thing ever, the weapon, but he knew that it would certainly bring an end to the war immediately. So on August 6th and August 9th of 1945, atomic weapons devastated the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And his decision was influenced by the potential casualties involved in an invasion of Japan, as well as a desire to end the war before the Soviet Union could intervene effectively and therefore claim a role in the making peace or the peace process. And undoubtedly, he felt hatred for Japan as much as any other American did, or any other patriotic American. And so this undoubtedly influenced his decision as well. But on August 15th, Japan surrendered unconditionally and the Second World War ended. Of course, millions of people perished in the war. Many areas lay in ruin. Despite the horrible cost of the war, there were improvements in technology and medicine that offered the hope of a better world after the war. And with the drafting of the UN Charter in 1945, everyone was hopeful for international cooperation this time. So, wartime diplomacy. The hopes of world peace and harmony really failed to materialize, largely because there was a split between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. During the war, American propaganda had persuaded the American public that the Soviet Union was a great ally. They were devoted. They loved peace. Joseph Stalin was portrayed as a kindly father figure. Joseph Davy said that Stalin was a kind, gentle man, and a child would love to come sit in his lap, or a dog edge up to his side. There was another journalist, Walter Duranty, that said that Stalin was remarkably long-suffering in the treatment of opposition. And this was a guy who had ruthlessly executed hundreds of his friends, his former friends, who he felt threatened him. And probably my favorite, in 1943, Time magazine named Stalin Man of the Year. Definitely these views were naive, but the war did create an identity of interest in defeating a common enemy, and we needed the help of the Soviet Union to do that, so that's what happened. Not to mention the fact that the Soviets expressed a willingness to cooperate in resolving post-war problems, and they were actually one of the original signers of the Declaration of the UN. May 1943, while the war was still going on, they had dissolved the Comintern, which was their official agency for spreading communism throughout the world. In October, the Big Three, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia, or the USSR, established the European Advisory Commission to set policy for the occupation of Germany. And they met and cooperated constructively at Tehran and Yalta. At San Francisco, the Allies created the United Nations Organization, which had a General Assembly, which the General Assembly was made up of delegates from all nations participating in the UN, and then there was a Security Council that consisted of 5 permanent members and 6 rotating members. And it was the Security Council that was responsible for maintaining world peace. Really, any great power could block United Nations action, though. It wasn't really that hard to get around them. So even though the United States and the USSR had collaborated for peace terms, there was a long-held suspicion of Stalin. And before the war had even ended, the Allies had clashed over important issues. For one, Stalin was deeply resentful that they didn't come to him right away. When the United States and the Allies saw that he was in trouble, they delayed opening a second front in the East, where of course he was fighting for his life, not his, but the lives of his men against Germany. And at the same time, Stalin never really concealed his intention of exerting control over Eastern Europe. And he said he was protecting his western frontier by controlling Eastern Europe. But this really clashed with Western principles of self-determination, or allowing those places like Lithuania and Latvia and Poland to have their own government and free elections. The question of Poland was a difficult one because the war had actually begun with Germany's attack on Poland. And so Churchill felt like it should be returned to its pre-war status as a nation. But I think everyone knew that Stalin still wanted Poland. So at Yalta, both Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to let Stalin annex several sections of eastern Poland. And Stalin agreed, on the other hand, to allow the Poles to have free elections, which really was a commitment he probably never intended to keep. So a pro-Soviet regime was installed in Poland. And then at Potsdam, the new president, Truman, met with Stalin and the British leadership. And Potsdam really formalized the occupation of Germany. At this point, Truman made no concessions to the Soviets. Like, we had an atomic bomb and it had proved successful. So we didn't really concede anything else to the Soviets. But Stalin refused to relinquish his hold on Eastern Europe. And so suspicions mounted, positions hardened on both sides. And as World War II came to an end, it marked the beginning of a new international order that was dominated by the Soviet-American rivalry. And so this will take us to a discussion of the Cold War in future chapters.